The camera does not open on a battlefield or a throne room, but on a galaxy already exhausted by choices it barely understood. At the time they were made, the Clone Wars are often framed as a dramatic collapse. But the more accurate reading is that they functioned as a slow internal excavation, removing load-bearing supports until the structure still stood, yet could no longer carry its own weight. What followed was not sudden ruin, but inevitable failure, because the damage was not cosmetic or military, it was systemic, cultural, and procedural, embedded into every institution that claimed to survive the war. The Republic did not simply fall, it was methodically hollowed out from within, as emergency powers were granted, then normalized and finally rendered invisible. Within the daily operation of governance, senators learned that survival depended less on representation and more on compliance, and silence committee processes slowed or vanished, oversight became performative, and corruption was no longer a deviation, but a survival strategy, as corporate blocs and regional powers exploited wartime urgency to entrench influence. The Senate floor remained intact, but its function shifted from deliberation to validation. The war taught the political class that fear moved faster than consensus, and once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned long before the word empire was spoken. Democracy had already been functionally retired, replaced by a system that mimicked its shape, while discarding its purpose. The Jedi Order collapse is often reduced to tragedy or betrayal, but its structural impact is more severe than its emotional weight. The Jedi were not merely warriors or mystics. They operated as a decentralized stabilizing class serving as mediators between worlds, investigators beyond political allegiance, and moral anchors within a system increasingly tolerant of compromise. Their presence allowed disputes to resolve without escalation and prevented regional conflicts from becoming systemic crises when they were erased. No replacement structure emerged. The Republic had quietly outsourced ethical arbitration and crisis response to an order it never truly understood. And once that order was gone, the vacuum remained permanent. Later regimes filled the space with enforcement, not guidance, surveillance, not mediation, and fear, not trust. The balance the Jedi provided was not restored. It was replaced with control mechanisms that addressed symptoms while worsening causes. The Clone Wars also rewired the galactic economy around sustained conflict. Entire systems pivoted industrial output toward weapons manufacturing, clone provisioning logistics networks, and corporate military contracts. These were not temporary adjustments, but total economic realignments that reshaped labour markets, trade routes, and planetary dependency. When the war ended, those industries did not dissolve. They rebranded security forces, became enforcement arms, corporate fleets became imperial auxiliaries, and black market syndicates absorbed surplus arms and expertise. Peace offered no comparable economic engine, so stability became financially inconvenient. The galaxy learned to profit from readiness rather than recovery, and that dependency ensured that conflict remained not an aberration, but an expectation. Physical devastation compounded these failures, as thousands of worlds were occupied, bombarded, strip-mined, or converted into staging grounds. Infrastructure, designed for civilian life, was repurposed or destroyed. Hyperlanes shifted to serve military logistics, isolating once connected regions. Cities emptied under prolonged occupation, and refugee populations destabilized neighboring systems, creating feedback loops of scarcity and unrest. Reconstruction was uneven and often conditional, favoring compliance over need. Decades later, many planets still operated at fractions of pre-war capacity, not due to lack of effort, but because the structural networks that once supported them had been permanently altered. The map of the galaxy itself became a record of unresolved damage. Perhaps most corrosive was the way the war normalized atrocity as policy. Once actions like mass conscription, civilian targeting, mind manipulation, and planetary annihilation were framed as strategic necessities. The moral floor collapsed. Decision-makers learned that any line could be crossed. If justified by survival rhetoric, the war did not introduce brutality to the galaxy, but it legitimized it within official doctrine. The Republic tolerated measures it would have once condemned, and by doing so taught future regimes that morality was flexible under pressure. The Empire did not invent these practices. It systematized and scaled them, inheriting a precedent already set by a government that believed it was acting temporarily. All of this meant that when the war ended, there was no intact foundation to rebuild upon. Institutions still existed, but trust had been drained from them, roles had been distorted, and incentives realigned toward control and compliance rather than service. The Clone Wars did not leave a wounded republic waiting to heal. They left an empty shell capable of being inhabited by any ideology that promised order. The galaxy did not transition from war to peace. It transitioned from visible conflict to managed domination, and understanding this structural damage is essential because it explains why later victories failed to produce lasting stability, and why the consequences of the war continue to echo long after the last battle ended, as the next era inherited not ruins but a system already trained to obey fear and efficiency, setting the stage for what followed. If the Clone Wars broke the structure of the galaxy, then what followed ensured that the damage would never fully heal, because the post-war order was not designed around recovery or reconciliation. It was designed around containment of trauma and enforcement of control. The systems that emerged did not misunderstand the cost of the war. They understood it perfectly and chose to manage its consequences rather than resolve its causes, creating a galaxy that learned to live with fear as infrastructure and obedience as culture. The clones represent the most literal expression of this mindset. Millions of sentient beings were engineered, trained, and deployed at industrial scale, then discarded with administrative efficiency. Once their usefulness expired, there was no reintegration framework, no legal recognition of personhood, no collective reckoning. With what had been done, their accelerated aging ensured the problem would solve itself quietly, and their absence from post-war discourse taught the galaxy a brutal lesson: that service did not guarantee dignity, and sacrifice did not guarantee memory. This precedent mattered because it established that entire populations could be created, used, and erased without destabilizing public conscience, setting the tone for how future regimes would treat both citizens and soldiers as expendable resources rather than stakeholders in a shared future. Fear quickly replaced ideology, as the primary language of governance worlds did not comply with imperial rule because they believed in its legitimacy. They complied because the consequences of defiance were visible and disproportionate: planetary destruction. Public executions and collective punishment were not anomalies. They were signals designed to travel faster than debate. This strategy worked not because it inspired loyalty, but because it trained survival instincts. Entire systems learned that neutrality was insufficient and resistance was fatal. And even after the fall of the Empire, those memories did not fade. Populations remembered what non-compliance had cost them, and that historical memory made genuine unity impossible because cooperation required trust, and trust had been methodically burned out of the political landscape. The Rebel Alliance is often framed as a healing force, but structurally, it was never built to repair what the war and empire had broken. It was an insurgency optimized to disrupt and overthrow, not to reconcile or rebuild. Its victory removed a regime, but did not address the cultural and institutional damage that regime inherited and amplified when the fighting ended. There was no shared narrative of recovery, no galactic process for truth, accountability, or collective healing. Liberated systems were left to manage their own trauma, often by reverting to local power structures that prioritized security over reform. The bleeding stopped, but the wound remained open beneath the surface, shaping every subsequent decision. This problem was compounded by the fact that every new government inherited a foundation already compromised. The New Republic reused Republic-era frameworks that had failed under pressure, assuming that removing the Emperor removed the flaw. But the flaw was procedural, not personal. Emergency powers, centralized authority, and reliance on militarized solutions were still embedded in governance culture. The First Order did not emerge from nowhere. It exploited these weaknesses by offering clarity and strength to systems exhausted by ambiguity. The cycle did not repeat accidentally. It repeated because the Clone Wars permanently altered how power was organized and justified across the galaxy, making authoritarian responses feel familiar rather than alarming. Perhaps the most enduring consequence is the lesson the galaxy internalized instead of rejecting authoritarianism. Outright, the prevailing belief became that strong rulers, secret armies, and overwhelming force were unfortunate necessities rather than moral failures Peace was redefined not as justice or balance, but as the absence of visible chaos control, became synonymous with safety, and dissent became synonymous with danger. This worldview did not vanish with any single regime. It persisted because it had been validated repeatedly by survival. The Clone Wars taught the galaxy that freedom was fragile and order was efficient, and once that equation took hold, it shaped every political calculation that followed. In the end, the tragedy of the Clone Wars is not simply that they led to the rise of the Empire, but that they reprogrammed the galaxy to accept cycles of domination as the price of stability. The damage was not undone by victories or reforms because it existed beneath policy, in assumptions, habits and fears, passed from one era to the next until control felt normal and peace felt conditional. The war ended, but its logic endured, and until that logic is confronted, the galaxy remains trapped in the shadow of a conflict that taught it the wrong lessons and left it structurally incapable of imagining a future not defined by fear.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.